A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The desert was trying to kill Seraphina, which she supposed was fair, considering she'd been trying to let it for the past 18 months, ever since the Sandstone Ridge Pack had cast her out with nothing but a single canteen of water and the clothes on her back, telling her that her silver hair was a curse that had brought drought to their lands, and that she needed to disappear into the wasteland before they decided execution was a more permanent solution to their problem. The sun hung overhead like a malevolent eye, unblinking and merciless, turning the sand beneath her feet into something that burned even through the worn soles of her boots, each step sending little puffs of scorching dust into air so dry it felt like breathing shards of glass. And Seraphina kept walking because walking was all she had left. Walking and the stubborn refusal to simply lie down and let the desert take her, even though part of her whispered that it would be easier, cleaner, more dignified than dying of thirst while still trying desperately to reach a settlement that might not even exist anymore. Her silver hair, that beautiful, cursed, impossible silver hair that had marked her as different from the moment she'd been born, hung in a long braid down her back, the metallic strands catching the brutal sunlight and throwing it back in ways that made her feel like a beacon for every predator and scavenger within miles, and she'd thought about cutting it off 100 times over the past year and a half. Thought about taking her knife and sawing through the braid until nothing remained but a ragged stubble that wouldn't mark her as the cursed Omega who'd brought disaster to her pack. But she never did it. Never could quite bring herself to sever that last connection to the girl she'd been before Darius had rejected her in front of the entire pack on what should have been their wedding day. Before he'd looked at her with disgust instead of love and told everyone assembled that he refused to mate with a woman whose very appearance was an affront to the moon goddess, that her silver hair was clearly a sign of something wrong and twisted and unnatural. The memory still had the power to make her stumble even after all this time, even with dehydration, making her thoughts slow and sticky, like honey left too long in the sun. And Seraphina pressed one hand against the burning rock formation beside her to steady herself, feeling the heat seep through her palm while her vision swam and darkened at the edges, her body's way of telling her that she was dangerously close to the point of no return, that if she didn't find water soon, then all the walking and surviving and stubborn refusal to simply give up would amount to nothing more than a slightly longer death than if she'd just let the pack execute her cleanly. She had one canteen left, had been rationing it so carefully that each sip felt like swallowing liquid diamonds, and when she'd checked it this morning, there had been maybe 2 cups of water remaining, enough to keep her alive for perhaps another day if she was very careful and very lucky, though luck had never been something Seraphina possessed in abundance. She'd been walking for 3 days since the last oasis, heading toward the Mesa Pack settlement that was supposedly another 5 days northeast, though she had no real way of knowing if the information she'd traded for back at the last way station was accurate, or if the grizzled old wolf who'd told her about it had simply been sending her to her death for the entertainment value. People did that sometimes with outcasts like her, sent them wandering into the deep desert with false hope and bad directions, because there was something amusing about watching the desperate and the damned chase mirages until the sun and sand claimed them. And Seraphina had learned not to trust easily, not to believe in kindness or charity, or the idea that anyone might help her without expecting something in return. The sandstorm yesterday had stripped away what little she'd managed to carry, the brutal wind tearing her supply pack from her shoulders and sending it tumbling away across the dunes before she could grab it, and she'd lost her extra water, her food stores, her medical supplies, everything except the clothes she wore and the single canteen that had been strapped to her belt. So now she had nothing except the determination to keep moving forward, and the healing gift that pulsed quietly in her chest. The magical awareness that let her sense injuries and illness in living things, though it was utterly useless for keeping herself alive in a landscape where the only living things for miles were sand scorpions and the occasional hawk circling overhead, looking for carrion. The sound that made her stop walking was so quiet she almost missed it beneath the constant whisper of wind across sand. Just a soft whimper that could have been anything or nothing, the desert playing tricks on ears that were starved for any sound, besides her own labored breathing and the crunch of sand beneath her boots. But her healing sense had flickered to life at the same moment, that familiar awareness suddenly flooding through her with an intensity that made her gasp, because whatever was making that sound was in terrible pain, was dying, was suffering in ways that made her gift scream with the wrongness of it. And Seraphina found herself turning toward the sound before rational thought could intervene and remind her that she had no resources to help anyone, that she was barely keeping herself alive, that investigating mysterious sounds in the desert was how people ended up dead in creative and unpleasant ways. She rounded a large rock formation that jutted up from the sand like a broken tooth, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and heat, and what she found on the other side made her breath catch in her throat and her heart stutter in her chest, because there was a wolf lying in the sand. And not just any wolf, but the most magnificent creature she'd ever seen. Massive enough that he had to be an alpha, his shoulder reaching what would have been nearly 5 feet if he'd been standing, and his fur was silver. Perfect metallic silver that matched her hair so exactly it was like looking at her own reflection transformed into lupine form. His eyes, when they flickered open briefly, were the color of silver touched by blue, like moonlight on deep water, and they looked at her with an intelligence and awareness that spoke of a shifted werewolf rather than a true animal, someone trapped in their wolf form either by choice or because they were too injured and too weak to manage the excruciating process of transformation. The blood matting his silver fur was dark and fresh, spreading in patches across his side where deep gashes had torn through skin and muscle, claw marks that spoke of a vicious fight with something large and determined to kill, and Seraphina's healing sense catalogued the injuries with clinical precision, even as her heart broke at the sight of them. 3 deep lacerations across his ribs, an arrow embedded in his left shoulder, with the shaft snapped off, but the head still buried deep in the muscle. Severe dehydration that had his tongue swollen and his breathing rapid and shallow. And blood loss that meant he had perhaps 20 minutes left before his body simply gave up and stopped fighting. She should walk away, should preserve her own precious resources, and continue toward the Mesopac settlement, where she might, if the moon goddess showed unexpected mercy, actually manage to survive long enough to trade her healing services for food and shelter, and a few more weeks of existence in a world that had made abundantly clear it had no real use for silver-haired Omegas who reminded people of curses and bad omens. But Seraphina had never been good at walking away from suffering, had never been able to ignore the pull of her healing gift when it recognized pain that could be eased and death that might be prevented. And looking at this magnificent silver wolf dying alone in the desert sand, she felt something crack open in her chest. Something that had been frozen and protected for 18 months of solitary survival. Suddenly thawing under the heat of compassion she'd tried so hard to kill, because compassion got you hurt and attachment got you destroyed, and caring about anything or anyone was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her hands were reaching for her canteen before she'd consciously made the decision, her fingers trembling as they worked the cap free, and she knelt beside the wolf in the scorching sand, feeling the heat soak through her worn pants while she looked into those silver blue eyes and saw awareness there, saw understanding, saw the exact moment when the wolf realized what she was about to do and tried to make a sound that might have been protest if he'd had the strength for it. "I know this is stupid," Serafina heard herself saying, her voice rough and cracked from days of minimal water and too much dry air, talking more to herself than to the wolf because she'd gotten into the habit of narrating her thoughts aloud during her months of isolation, using her own voice as company when there was no one else to break the terrible silence of being completely alone. "I know I'm probably signing my own death warrant by doing this, that I need this water to survive, that you're a stranger who might kill me the second you have the strength to move, that this goes against every survival instinct I've managed to develop over the past year and a half of living in this godforsaken wasteland, but I've spent 18 months running and hiding and surviving, and I'm so tired of it. So tired of being nothing but a ghost who drifts from place to place without ever mattering to anyone or anything, and maybe if I save your life, it will mean something. Maybe it will prove that I'm not just the cursed Omega everyone said I was. Maybe it will give me one good thing to balance against all the terrible things that have happened since Darius looked at me with disgust and told the entire pack that I wasn't worthy of being his mate." The wolf's eyes tracked her movement as she began pouring her precious water over his wounds, using half of what remained to clean the gashes across his ribs, washing away sand and blood and debris, while her healing gift guided her hands with the sure knowledge of what needed to be done. And she pulled herbs from the small medicine pouch she'd managed to keep tied to her belt through the sandstorm, crushing them between her palms and packing them into the deepest cuts to prevent infection and encourage the flesh to knit itself back together. The arrow in his shoulder required all her concentration and most of her remaining courage, because removing it was going to hurt him terribly, and there was always the risk that a shifter in pain might lash out instinctively, might sink those massive fangs into her throat before conscious thought could override animal panic. But she gripped the broken shaft firmly and pulled in one smooth motion, feeling the arrowhead tear free from muscle and tissue, while the wolf's entire body went rigid with agony, though he didn't make a sound beyond a soft whine that somehow hurt worse than if he'd been screaming. She used the last of her water to clean the arrow wound and hydrate him, tipping the canteen against his muzzle and letting the liquid trickle into his mouth, watching his throat work as he swallowed reflexively. And when the canteen was empty, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, despite knowing that she'd just condemned herself to death, because at least this death would mean something, would be a choice she made rather than a punishment inflicted on her by people who decided her appearance made her unworthy of basics kindness. Her healing gift was screaming at her to do more, to dig deeper into her reserves and channel her life energy directly into this dying wolf, to use the ability she'd inherited from her mother that went beyond normal pack healing into something older and more dangerous. Something her mother had called life weaving and had warned her never to use unless she was prepared to pay the price it demanded. Serafina had never used it before, had been too afraid of what it might cost her. But looking at this silver wolf, whose fur matched her cursed hair, whose eyes held an intelligence and awareness that suggested he was someone important, someone whose death would matter in ways her own never would, she made a decision that felt simultaneously like the stupidest and most right thing she'd ever done. She placed both hands on his chest, feeling the labored thump of his heart beneath her palms, feeling the heat of his blood and the terrible weakness of a body that had been pushed far beyond its limits. And she reached deep inside herself, past the normal reservoir of healing energy she used for minor injuries and simple ailments, past the safety barriers her mother had taught her never to cross, down into the core of her life force, where her very essence burned like a silver flame. The power that flooded through her when she grabbed hold of that flame was overwhelming, was agonizing, was like every nerve in her body had been set on fire while simultaneously being plunged into ice water, and she channeled all of it into the wolf, pouring her life energy into his failing system, encouraging his body to heal faster than should have been possible, knitting torn muscle and shattered tissue, purging infection from his blood, and jump-starting his natural regeneration, giving him everything she had because she'd spent 18 months with nothing and no one. And if this was how she died, then at least it would be while doing something that mattered. The world tilted sideways as the backlash hit her, as her body tried to process the fact that she'd just drained herself past safe limits while already dangerously dehydrated and exhausted. And Serafina felt herself falling, felt the sand rising up to meet her, felt consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. And the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the wolf beginning to shimmer with silver light as his body finally had enough strength to shift, bones cracking and reforming, fur receding to reveal bronze skin and long silver hair, and eyes the color of moonlight on water, looking at her with an expression that might have been awe or horror or something else entirely that she was too far gone to identify. Her last coherent thought before she collapsed completely was that the silver-haired man kneeling where the wolf had been was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, and that dying while looking at something beautiful was probably better than dying alone in the sand with nothing but her own bitter thoughts for company. And then there was nothing but darkness and the distant sound of a voice calling her name in a tone of desperate command, though how this stranger could possibly know her name was a mystery. Her fading consciousness couldn't begin to unravel, and Serafina let herself fall into the welcoming void where at least there was no more pain, no more loneliness, no more walking through endless desert, while the world reminded her with every scorching step that cursed Omegas with silver hair weren't meant to survive, weren't meant to matter, weren't meant to find anything but rejection and exile and slow death beneath an unforgiving sun. Consciousness returned to Serafina in fragments, like shattered glass being pieced back together by hands that weren't quite steady. And the first thing she became aware of was softness beneath her body. Something so foreign after 18 months of sleeping on sand and stone that her mind couldn't quite process what it meant. Couldn't reconcile the sensation of clean sheets and comfortable mattress with her last memory of collapsing in the desert beside a dying wolf who'd somehow transformed into a silver-haired man whose face had been the last beautiful thing she'd expected to see before death claimed her. The second thing she noticed was the sound of water. Not the desperate, precious ration drops from a nearly empty canteen, but the gentle splash and burble of flowing water, abundant water. Water that spoke of springs and fountains, and a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed in a world where every sip had to be calculated against survival. And for a moment, she thought she must be dead. Must have finally succumbed to dehydration and exhaustion and the terrible price of using her life-weaving gift beyond safe limits. Because surely this softness and water sound was what the moon goddess offered to souls who'd suffered enough in life. Her eyes opened slowly, lids heavy as if weighted with sand, and instead of endless blue sky or the dark void of death, she found herself staring at a ceiling carved from red gold stone, its surface smooth and beautiful, inlaid with veins of silver that seemed to glow with their own internal light, catching and reflecting illumination from oil lamps that burned in wall sconces around what was clearly a bedroom, a luxurious bedroom that made her small cabin back in the sandstone ridge pack look like a hovel with gauzy curtains that drifted in a breeze that smelled of night-blooming flowers and clean water, and something else, something wild and masculine that made her healing sense flutter to life with recognition, even though she couldn't quite place why that particular scent made her heart rate accelerate. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as her body screamed in protest, every muscle feeling like it had been wrung out and left to dry in the brutal sun. Her head spinning so violently she had to grab the edge of the mattress to keep from falling despite already being horizontal. And a voice spoke from somewhere to her left, deep and rich and flavored, with an authority that made something in her omega instincts want to roll over and submit, even as her stubborn pride bristled at the very idea. "Don't try to move too quickly," the voice said, and Seraphina's head turned despite the protest of strained neck muscles to find the silver-haired man from the desert sitting in a chair beside her bed. His long legs stretched out before him, and his arms crossed over a chest that was broader and more muscular than she'd registered during those few seconds of consciousness before she'd passed out. Wearing simple dark pants and a loose white shirt that somehow looked regal despite its plainness, and those silver blue eyes were watching her with an intensity that made her feel like she was being examined down to her very soul, catalogued and assessed and measured against some standard she couldn't begin to guess at. "You've been unconscious for 2 days, and the healers said you depleted your life force so severely that it's going to take weeks for you to fully recover. And that's assuming you rest properly and don't do anything stupid, like try to use your gift again before your body has replenished what you spent saving my life in the middle of the desert, when any sensible person would have kept walking and preserved their own resources." The accusation in his tone, the suggestion that she'd been foolish or reckless, sparked something hot and defensive in Seraphina's chest, burning through the exhaustion and confusion to kindle a familiar anger that had sustained her through 18 months of surviving in a world that kept insisting she shouldn't. And she found her voice, even though it came out rough and raw, like she'd been screaming for hours. "I couldn't leave you there to die. Couldn't walk past someone who was suffering when I had the ability to help, even if it meant using the last of my water and draining myself to dangerous levels, because I've spent the past 1.5 years being treated like I'm worthless and cursed and not deserving of basic kindness, and I refuse to become the kind of person who can look at suffering and just walk away because it's inconvenient or dangerous. Because if I become that, then Darius and the Sandstone Ridgepack win. They get to turn me into something cold and hard and broken. And I won't give them that satisfaction, even if it means dying in the sand beside a stranger who probably thinks I'm an idiot for wasting my resources on someone I didn't know." The man's expression shifted at her words, something that might have been pain or admiration or both flickering through those remarkable eyes, and he leaned forward in his chair, his elbows coming to rest on his knees as he studied her with an attention that made her skin prickle with awareness, made her suddenly conscious of the fact that she was lying in a bed, wearing what felt like a borrowed nightgown, clean and soft against skin that had been covered in desert dust and dried sweat and the grime of 3 days without proper washing. "You're not an idiot," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made the words feel weighted with more meaning than their surface simplicity suggested, something that made her healing sense ping with recognition, even though her exhausted mind couldn't quite grasp what it was trying to tell her. "You're possibly the bravest and most compassionate person I've ever met, which is saying something considering I've spent the past 3 years ruling over 15 allied packs and meeting hundreds of wolves who all want to impress me with their strength and cunning and ruthless efficiency. And not one of them would have done what you did. Not one of them would have sacrificed their last water for a dying stranger without even knowing who I was or what saving me might mean for their future." The words, "ruling over 15 allied packs," penetrated the fog of exhaustion slowly, too slowly, her mind trying to process what that meant, while her body fought against the heaviness that wanted to drag her back into unconscious darkness. And Serafina heard herself asking the question, even though part of her already knew the answer, already understood why this man's presence felt like standing too close to a bonfire, why her omega instincts kept insisting she should lower her eyes and show respect to someone whose dominance was written into every line of his powerful body. Who are you exactly, and where am I? Because the last thing I remember is collapsing in the desert after using my life weaving gift to save a silver wolf, and now I'm waking up in what looks like a palace, with you sitting beside my bed telling me about ruling allied packs. Like that's just a casual detail you forgot to mention during the whole dying in the sand situation. His smile was slight but genuine, transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her breath catch, despite her determination not to be affected by physical appearance. Not to fall into the trap of thinking that beauty meant kindness or that attraction meant safety, because Darius had been beautiful too, and he'd still rejected her in front of everyone she knew, had still looked at her silver hair with disgust and called her cursed and unnatural. My name is Lysander Moonshadow, though most people call me Lys, and I'm the Alpha King of the Silver Moon Kingdom, which encompasses all the desert territories from the scorched flats to the canyon reaches, and you're currently in my palace, which is carved into the red cliffs of Silver Canyon, where the ancient springs provide water enough to sustain my entire pack and the gardens that make this place livable despite being surrounded by desert wasteland. He paused, and something complicated crossed his features, something that looked almost like nervousness, which seemed impossible for someone who'd just casually announced he was royalty. And you saved my life 2 days ago when I was dying from injuries sustained during a rogue ambush that separated me from my guards. When I'd been running for 2 days straight with an arrow in my shoulder and deep claw wounds that were starting to fester. When I'd finally collapsed, believing I was going to die alone in the sand, without ever finding the mate I've been searching for. And then you appeared like something out of a fever dream, with your silver hair and your golden eyes, and you gave me your last water, even though it meant condemning yourself to death. Serafina's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the wounded wolf she'd found with the powerful Alpha sitting beside her bed, trying to understand how she'd gone from dying in the desert to waking up in a palace, trying to process the casual way he'd mentioned searching for a mate like it was relevant to this conversation, and her voice came out sharper than she'd intended when she finally managed to speak again. So, you're telling me that I used the last of my water and nearly killed myself using my life-weaving gift to save the Alpha King? And now, I'm what? Supposed to be grateful that you brought me back to your palace instead of leaving me to die in the sand after I served my purpose. Supposed to thank you for the medical care and the comfortable bed, like they're gifts instead of the bare minimum you owe someone who literally gave you her life force to keep you breathing. The words were unfair, and she knew it even as they left her mouth, knew that her anger wasn't really directed at this man who'd apparently commanded his guards to rescue her along with him, but at the universe that kept putting her in impossible situations, at the moon goddess who'd cursed her with silver hair and then abandoned her to suffer the consequences, at herself for being stupid enough to sacrifice everything for a stranger, when experience had taught her that selflessness only ever got her hurt. Lysander didn't rise to her anger, didn't show offense or irritation at her sharp tone, and instead, his expression gentled into something that looked almost like understanding, like he could see past her defensive hostility to the fear and hurt underneath. The bone-deep terror of someone who'd learned that kindness always came with strings attached, and that accepting help meant owing debts she couldn't afford to pay. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said quietly, his voice pitched low and soothing in a way that made her want to trust him, despite every instinct screaming that trust was dangerous, that opening herself to anyone would only lead to more rejection and pain. If anything, I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay, because you saved my life when you had absolutely no reason to. When doing so, put your own survival at terrible risk. And I want you to understand something very clearly, Serafina. You're not a prisoner here. You're not an obligation or a burden. You're an honored guest who will be cared for until you've fully recovered from the damage using your life-weaving gift caused. And after that, you're free to leave or stay as you choose, with no expectations or demands placed on you beyond allowing my healers to help you regain your strength. The fact that he knew her name when she'd never told him sent a spike of alarm through her exhausted body, made her push herself more upright despite the way her muscles screamed in protest, made her demand with all the authority she could muster while wearing a borrowed nightgown and feeling like she'd been trampled by a herd of wild horses. How do you know my name? Because I definitely didn't introduce myself before I passed out, and I don't appreciate the idea that you've been going through my belongings or questioning me while I was unconscious. Lysander had the grace to look slightly sheepish, one hand coming up to run through his long silver hair in a gesture that was so unconsciously human it made something in her chest twist with an emotion she refused to examine too closely. You talked quite a bit while you were unconscious. Fever dreams, mostly. But you said your name several times along with other things. Details about your past and your rejection and the pact that banished you. And I swear to you on my honor as Alpha King that I didn't pry or encourage it. That my healers simply monitored you and reported anything that seemed medically relevant. Though I'll admit, I listened when they told me about the silver-haired Omega who'd been cast out by the Sandstone Ridge Pack for supposedly bringing drought, who'd spent 18 months surviving alone in the desert, who had a healing gift strong enough to bring someone back from the very edge of death. Humiliation burned hot in Serafina's cheeks at the thought of this powerful alpha hearing her fever-addled confessions, hearing about Darius's rejection and the cruel things her pack had said about her appearance, hearing all the broken, desperate thoughts she'd kept locked away during her months of isolation, because speaking them aloud would make them too real, too painful, and she wanted to curl into herself and disappear, wanted to use what little strength she had to run from this beautiful room and this beautiful man and the kindness in his eyes that she didn't know how to accept without waiting for the other shoe to drop. So now you know all my pathetic secrets. Know that I'm the cursed Omega everyone rejected, that I'm the one who supposedly brought drought and disaster to my pack, that my own mate looked at me on our wedding day and decided I wasn't worth claiming. And you're what? Keeping me here out of pity, out of some sense of obligation because I saved your life, and now you feel like you have to pretend I'm not exactly what everyone has always said I am. A walking bad omen, with hair that proves I'm touched by something wrong and unnatural. The sound Lysander made was somewhere between a growl and a sigh, and suddenly he was on his feet, was moving to sit on the edge of her bed, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent wrapped around her like a physical presence, wild and clean with undertones of desert sage and something uniquely him that made her want to lean closer, even as her defensive instincts screamed at her to maintain distance. Listen to me very carefully, Serafina, because I'm only going to say this once, and I need you to hear it. Really hear it, not filtered through whatever poison your former pack poured into your ears. His hand lifted slowly, telegraphing the movement so she had time to pull away if she wanted. And when she didn't, he gently tucked a strand of her silver hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her temple in a touch that felt far too intimate for two people who were essentially strangers. Your silver hair isn't a curse. It's a blessing, a mark of something special and rare that ignorant wolves were too stupid to recognize. And the fact that your pack suffered drought after you were born is coincidence, not causation. Because if you actually brought disaster, then this palace wouldn't be experiencing the most abundant water flow we've had in 5 years. The springs wouldn't be running higher and clearer than they have since my mother died, and the gardens wouldn't be blooming with flowers that haven't grown here in decades. Seraphina's breath caught at his words, at the implication that her presence was somehow causing the opposite of drought. That instead of bringing disaster, she might be bringing life and growth, but she couldn't let herself believe it. Couldn't afford to hope that maybe the Sandstone Ridge Pack had been wrong about her, because hope was dangerous, and hope led to disappointment, and she'd learned through brutal experience that it was safer to expect nothing than to risk being crushed when expectations weren't met. You're just saying that to make me feel better? To ease your conscience about the broken Omega you felt obligated to rescue, but we both know that silver hair on a wolf is unnatural, that it marks someone as different and strange, that no alpha in their right mind would choose a mate who looks like I do when there are hundreds of beautiful, normal Omegas who would jump at the chance to be Luna to an alpha king. Her voice cracked on the last words, betraying more vulnerability than she'd intended, revealing the deep wound that Darius's rejection had carved into her soul. The fundamental belief that she was unworthy of love or acceptance or anything beyond the bare tolerance of wolves who viewed her as useful for her healing gift, but fundamentally flawed as a person. Lysander's other hand came up to frame her face, both his palms cradling her cheeks, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the raw power she could sense coiled beneath his skin, and his silver blue eyes bored into hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, impossible to dismiss what he was saying as mere platitudes meant to soothe her damaged pride. My mother had silver hair exactly like yours, long and metallic and beautiful, and she was the most powerful Luna this kingdom has ever known, beloved by everyone who knew her. And she had the same life-weaving gift you possess, the same ability to heal beyond normal limits, the same capacity to bring growth and abundance wherever she went. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling, and his voice dropped to something almost reverent when he continued. She died 3 years ago, saving my father's life during an ambush, used her life-weaving gift the same way you used yours to save me. And with her last breath, she told me that one day I would meet another silver-haired Omega with a healer's heart, that she would save my life when I was at my lowest point, and that I needed to recognize her for what she was. Not a curse, but the greatest blessing the moon goddess could grant. My destined mate, and the future Luna, who would lead our kingdom into an era of unprecedented prosperity. The words hung between them like a physical presence, heavy with implication and promise and terrifying possibility, and Seraphina felt her entire world tilt on its axis as understanding crashed through her exhausted mind, as she realized what he was saying, what he was suggesting, what the intense way he was looking at her actually meant. You think I'm your mate, she whispered, the words barely audible over the sudden pounding of her heart, over the rush of blood in her ears, and the panicked flutter of her Omega instincts that were simultaneously screaming at her to accept and to run, to lean into this possibility and to protect herself from the inevitable pain of another rejection. You think that because I have silver hair like your mother, and because I saved your life, and because some prophecy she gave you 3 years ago, that means we're destined to be together, that the moon goddess intended for me to be your Luna. But you don't know me. You don't know how broken I am, how damaged and used up and incapable of being what an alpha king needs in a mate. And when you figure that out, when you realize that I'm not the blessing your mother promised, but just a cursed Omega who's been barely surviving in the desert for 18 months, you're going to reject me the same way Darius did, and I can't survive that again. I can't let myself hope and believe and open up only to have someone else look at me with disgust and tell me I'm not good enough. Lysander's expression transformed into something fierce and protective, his hands tightening slightly on her face, as if he could physically hold her together through the force of his conviction alone. And when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable command of an alpha who expected to be obeyed, whose word was law across 15 allied packs and hundreds of miles of territory. I am never going to reject you, Seraphina. Not today, not tomorrow, not in 100 years, because I felt the mate bond snap into place the moment I shifted back to human form in the desert and saw you collapsing beside me. Felt it lock around my heart and soul with a rightness that made everything else in my life suddenly make sense. Every failed courtship and every Omega I turned away because something felt wrong, it was all leading me to you, to the moment when a silver-haired healer would give me her last water and prove that true strength has nothing to do with dominance or power, and everything to do with compassion and sacrifice and the courage to be kind in a cruel world. He leaned closer, his forehead coming to rest against hers, his breath warm against her lips, and she could feel the mate bond he was talking about starting to pulse between them, tentative and fragile, like a newborn thing, calling to something deep in her chest that recognized him as hers, even as her mind rebelled against the impossibility of it all. But I'm not going to force this on you, not going to demand you accept the bond just because fate says we're meant to be together, because you deserve the choice that Darius never gave you, the choice to accept or reject on your own terms. And whatever you decide, I'll respect it, even if rejecting the mate bond destroys me, even if watching you walk away is the hardest thing I'll ever have to do, because you deserve agency and freedom and the right to choose your own destiny after spending so long having choices stolen from you by people who couldn't see your worth. The tears were flowing freely now, hot tracks down her cheeks that his thumbs kept trying to catch and wipe away, and Seraphina found herself trembling with the weight of too many emotions to process. Fear and hope and desperate longing and terror all tangled together into something that felt like it might tear her apart from the inside. And she wanted to accept, wanted to lean into this beautiful, impossible offer of belonging and partnership and love, but the scars from Darius's rejection were too deep, too fresh, too painful to ignore. I need time, she finally managed to choke out, her voice breaking on the words. I need time to heal and think and figure out if this is real or if I'm just so desperate for acceptance that I'm imagining the mate bond, that I'm seeing what I want to see instead of what's actually there. And I need you to promise me that if I ask for space, you'll give it to me, that you won't push or pressure or make me feel like I owe you acceptance because you saved my life after I saved yours, because I can't be with someone out of obligation or gratitude. I need it to be real, or I need it to be nothing at all. Lysander pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and the understanding and acceptance she saw there, the complete lack of anger or resentment at her request for time, made something crack open in her chest that had been frozen solid since the day Darius had publicly humiliated her. You have all the time you need, he said softly, and it sounded like a vow, like a promise written in the stars and sealed with blood. And I'll be here when you're ready, whether that's tomorrow or next month or next year, waiting and hoping but never demanding, because you're worth waiting for, Seraphina. Worth everything and more. And one day, I'm going to prove that to you in ways that make you believe it yourself. The gardens of the Silver Moon Palace had become Seraphina's sanctuary over the 5 weeks since she'd woken in that luxurious bedroom to find Lysander sitting beside her like a guardian watching over something precious. And she found herself drawn to them every evening as the brutal desert sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold and purple that reminded her of bruises healing, of wounds slowly transforming from something painful into something that proved you'd survived. The gardens themselves were a miracle in the middle of the wasteland, fed by the ancient springs that flowed beneath the palace with water so clear and cold it tasted like liquid silver. And everywhere she walked, she could feel her healing gift responding to the life around her, to the flowers that seemed to bloom brighter when she passed, to the fruit trees that had started producing unprecedented harvests, to the very soil itself that seemed to drink in her presence and transform it into growth and abundance that the palace gardeners whispered about in tones that mixed awe with something that might have been reverence. Elder Miriam had explained it to her during one of their long conversations in the healing halls, where Seraphina had started spending her mornings, helping with patients and learning techniques that went beyond what her mother had taught her before the rogue attack that had orphaned her and set her on the path that would eventually lead to rejection and exile, and a dying silver wolf in the desert sand. The old healer, with her weathered face and eyes that had seen more than Seraphina could imagine, had taken her hands one afternoon and told her with absolute certainty that she wasn't cursed, but blessed, that her silver hair marked her as a life weaver, one of the rarest gifts the moon goddess bestowed, appearing perhaps once in a generation, and that everything the Sandstone Ridge Pack had blamed her for, the drought and disaster they'd claimed she brought, was actually their own failing, their own inability to recognize that life weavers needed to give their gift freely for it to work, that forcing her into isolation and treating her like a curse had created a self-fulfilling prophecy where her gift turned inward and dormant instead of outward and abundant. Lysander's mother was the same, Miriam had said, her gnarled fingers squeezing Seraphina's with surprising strength, her voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom and observation. Katarina Moonshadow had that same silver hair, that same incredible healing ability, and when she first came to this palace as a young Omega, everyone whispered that she was cursed, that her strange appearance meant something was wrong with her. But the old Alpha King, Lysander's father, he recognized what she truly was, recognized that her differences weren't flaws but marks of destiny, and he claimed her as his mate despite the protests of his council and the fears of pack members who thought silver hair meant bad luck. The old healer's eyes had grown distant with memory, seeing something from years past that still had the power to move her. Within 6 months of her arrival, the springs began flowing stronger. The gardens that had been struggling started to thrive, and the entire kingdom entered into an era of prosperity that lasted until the day she died, saving her mate's life, using her life-weaving gift one final time to ensure that Lysander wouldn't lose both parents in that ambush. And with her last breath, she told him to watch for another silver-haired healer, told him that the moon goddess would send him his destined mate when he needed her most, and that he would recognize her by her willingness to sacrifice everything for someone she didn't know. The story had shaken something loose in Seraphina's carefully constructed defenses, had made her start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, everything she'd been told about herself had been a lie designed to make her small and manageable and easy to discard when she became inconvenient. And the wondering had led to watching, to paying attention to the way Lysander moved through his kingdom with quiet authority and genuine care for every wolf under his protection, to noticing how he treated the lowest Omega with the same respect he showed his highest-ranking advisors, to seeing the way he played with pups in the training grounds and listened patiently to elderly wolves reminiscing about the old days and personally visited the sick in the healing halls without fanfare or expectation of praise. She'd watched him in council meetings where he had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation and territorial disputes. Watched him balance mercy with justice in ways that proved he understood that true leadership wasn't about dominance, but about service. And she'd seen the way his eyes would find her across crowded rooms, the way his expression would soften when he looked at her, the way he kept his promise about giving her space while making absolutely certain she knew he was there. Waiting, hoping, believing in a future where she might choose to accept the mate bond that she could now feel pulsing between them like a silver thread connecting her heart to his. The bond had grown stronger as her body healed, as the damage from using her life-weaving gift repaired itself and her natural strength returned, and Seraphina had finally stopped being able to pretend she didn't feel it, stopped being able to ignore the way her Omega instincts recognized Lysander as hers, the way her healing gift reached for him whenever he was near, the way her entire being seemed to orient itself around his presence, like a flower turning toward the sun. It terrified her, this pull toward someone who could destroy her so completely if he chose to, this vulnerability that came with acknowledging that she wanted him, wanted the mate bond, wanted the impossible future he'd offered where she could be Luna and partner and equal instead of the cursed Omega everyone had always told her she was destined to be. But the terror was starting to be outweighed by something else, something that felt suspiciously like hope, like the tentative unfurling of a heart that had been locked away for protection, beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was safe to open again. Elder Miriam had been the one to finally push her toward making a decision, had found her in the gardens 3 days ago, standing beside the fountain where silver water cascaded over ancient stones and created rainbows in the fading light, and the old healer had settled beside her on the carved bench with a sigh that spoke of aching joints and too many years spent on her feet. "Child," Miriam had said without preamble, because the old woman had never been one to waste words on unnecessary pleasantries. "You're letting fear make your decisions, and fear is a terrible advisor, whispering poison about all the ways things could go wrong instead of showing you all the ways they could go right, and I understand why you're afraid. Understand that having your mate reject you in front of your entire pack would leave scars that don't heal quickly or easily, but you need to ask yourself something important." The healer had turned to look at her with eyes that saw too much, that seemed to pierce through all of Seraphina's careful defenses to the truth she'd been avoiding. "Are you happy here, in this palace, in this kingdom, with Lysander watching you, like you're the answer to every prayer he's ever whispered to the moon goddess?" The question had lodged itself in Seraphina's chest like a splinter, impossible to ignore, demanding an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to give, and she'd spent 3 days wrestling with it. 3 days of examining her life in the Silver Moon Palace and comparing it to the 18 months she'd spent surviving in the desert. 3 days of being ruthlessly honest with herself about what she wanted versus what she was afraid to want. The truth, when she finally let herself acknowledge it, was devastatingly simple and terrifyingly complex all at once. Because yes, she was happy here, happier than she'd ever been in her entire life, happier than she'd been even before Darius's rejection. Because this place and these people and this silver-haired alpha who looked at her like she was something precious had given her what the Sandstone Ridge Pack never had. had given her belonging and purpose, and the freedom to be exactly who she was, without apology or shame. She loved him, had fallen in love with Lysander, somewhere between his patient visits to her sick room and their long conversations in the gardens, between watching him lead with wisdom and compassion, and seeing the way he honored his mother's memory by treating every life-weaver gift as sacred rather than cursed, between the moments when he made her laugh and the moments when he listened to her talk about her pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or suggest that she should just get over it and move on. He'd given her time and space and respect, had given her the choice that Darius had stolen, and in doing so he'd proven himself worthy of the trust she was so terrified to offer. And standing in the gardens now as the sun painted the desert in colors that reminded her of healing bruises, Seraphina made her decision, felt it settle into her bones with the weight of inevitability and rightness, felt the mate bond flare to brilliant life in her chest, as if it knew what she was about to do and was celebrating the surrender of her fear to something infinitely more powerful. Lysander found her there as the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky, his long silver hair loose around his shoulders and his expression careful, neutral, giving nothing away because he'd learned over the past 5 weeks that she needed him to not pressure her, needed him to let her come to conclusions on her own time without feeling pushed or manipulated, and he stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for her to acknowledge him, waiting for permission to approach. And the fact that the Alpha King of 15 allied packs was giving her that kind of deference made something warm and precious bloom in her chest. "I've made a decision," Seraphina said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs, despite the fear that still whispered that this was a mistake, that opening herself to love was opening herself to devastation. But she'd spent 5 weeks watching Lysander prove himself in ways large and small, and she was choosing to believe in what she'd seen, rather than in the poison her former pack had poured into her soul. "About us, about the mate bond, about everything you offered me that first day when I was terrified and broken and convinced that accepting you would just lead to another rejection." She watched understanding dawn across his handsome features, watched hope war with caution in those remarkable silver blue eyes, watched him take a single step closer and then stop, still giving her control, still letting her set the pace and the terms. And she loved him even more for that restraint, for that fundamental respect for her autonomy that Darius had never shown, that her former pack had never offered. "I spent 18 months believing I was cursed," Seraphina continued, closing the distance between them herself, watching his eyes widen slightly as she moved into his space, as she reached up to lay one hand over his heart and felt it thundering beneath her palm. 18 months convinced that my silver hair marked me as wrong and unnatural, that I was destined to bring disaster to anyone foolish enough to care about me, that the best thing I could do for the world was disappear into the desert and die alone where I couldn't hurt anyone else with my presence. And I was so close to giving up, so close to just lying down in the sand and letting the sun take me. And then I found you, found a silver wolf dying in the wasteland. And something in me recognized something in you even before I knew who you were or what saving you would mean. Her other hand came up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone, and she felt him lean into her touch like he'd been starving for it, felt the mate bond between them strengthen and solidify into something that would take more than fear to break. "You've spent 5 weeks proving to me that everything I believed about myself was wrong, showing me through your actions and your patience and your unwavering certainty that I'm not cursed but blessed, that my differences aren't flaws but gifts, that the pack who rejected me was blind and stupid and unworthy of the loyalty I gave them for 24 years, Seraphina said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words, but she pushed through because he needed to hear this, needed to understand what his faith in her had accomplished. You've given me back myself, Lysander, given me permission to be proud of my silver hair and my healing gift and all the things that make me different, and you've done it without asking for anything in return, without demanding gratitude or obligation, just offering acceptance and respect and love that doesn't require me to be anything other than exactly who I am. Lysander's hands came up to cover hers, where they rested against his face, his fingers threading through hers, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion that he wasn't bothering to hide or control. You gave me your last water in the desert, Seraphina. Used your life-weaving gift to save a stranger, when doing so meant signing your own death warrant. And in that moment, you showed me what true strength looks like, what real courage means, what the moon goddess values in a Luna who will lead beside her Alpha King. And I've spent 5 weeks falling more in love with you every single day, watching you bloom in an environment that values you, watching you recognize your own worth, watching you transform from someone who believed she was cursed into someone who's starting to understand that she's the greatest blessing this kingdom could ask for. His forehead came down to rest against hers, and she could feel his breath warm against her lips, could feel the mate bond singing between them with joy and anticipation and the certainty of destiny fulfilled. Tell me. You've decided? Tell me if I get to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice, or if I need to let you go and somehow survive watching you walk away from everything we could be together. Seraphina smiled, felt it spread across her face like sunrise breaking over the desert, felt the last of her fear crumble under the weight of certainty and love, and the bone-deep knowledge that this was right, that he was hers and she was his, and the moon goddess had been guiding them toward this moment since before either of them was born. I choose you, she said simply, and the words felt like a vow, like a promise, like the beginning of a story that would be told for generations. I choose us, choose the mate bond, choose to be your Luna and your partner and your equal, choose to stop running from my destiny and start embracing it. Choose to believe that my silver hair and my healing gift and everything that makes me different are exactly what they were always meant to be. Marks of blessing rather than curse, signs that I was born to stand beside an Alpha King and help him lead a kingdom into prosperity and abundance and joy. The kiss that followed was inevitable, was perfect, was everything a first kiss between destined mates should be, and when Lysander's lips met hers, the mate bond between them exploded into brilliant silver light, flooding through both their bodies and souls with a rightness that made Seraphina gasp against his mouth, made her cling to him as the bond settled into place with the finality of a lock clicking home. Two halves of a whole finally reunited after being separated for far too long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the bond's energy, Lysander pulled her tight against his chest, and she could hear his heart racing beneath her ear, could feel his hands shaking slightly where they pressed against her back, and she understood that he'd been just as terrified as she was, just as afraid that she might choose to walk away, just as desperate for this connection that now burned between them like a silver flame that nothing could extinguish. The marking ceremony 3 days later was witnessed by the entire Silver Moon Kingdom and representatives from all 15 allied packs, and Seraphina wore a gown of silver silk that seemed to have been woven from moonlight itself. her long silver hair adorned with white desert flowers that bloomed out of season because her life-weaving gift had coaxed them into existence. And when Lysander marked her neck before the gathered crowd, claiming her as his mate, and Luna before the moon goddess and all witnesses, she felt the bond between them solidify into something eternal and unbreakable. She marked him in return, her teeth finding the joint of his neck and shoulder, and the equality of that exchange, the visual proof that she was his equal rather than his possession, made several of the watching alphas gasp in surprise while the omegas cheered with an enthusiasm that suggested they understood exactly how revolutionary this Luna was going to be. Years later, when young wolves came to Luna Seraphina feeling broken and cursed, and convinced that their differences made them unworthy of love, she would take their hands and tell them her story about being rejected and banished, about wandering the desert for 18 months, believing she was cursed, about giving her last water to a dying silver wolf and discovering that sacrifice born of compassion was the most powerful magic of all. I was nobody, she would tell them, her silver hair still long and beautiful, her amber eyes full of wisdom earned through suffering and redemption. I was the cursed Omega everyone rejected, the one they blamed for drought and disaster, the one who believed she deserved to die alone in the desert where she couldn't hurt anyone. But the moon goddess had different plans, had marked me from birth for a destiny I couldn't imagine, and all I had to do was choose compassion over self-preservation, choose to help a stranger even when it meant condemning myself to death, choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was worth more than the pack who rejected me ever recognized. She would introduce them to Lysander, still strong and handsome, still looking at her with the same love and reverence he'd shown that first evening in the gardens when she'd chosen him. Chosen them. Chosen to believe in a future where cursed Omegas with silver hair could become beloved Lunas who brought prosperity and abundance to an entire kingdom. And together, they would tell these broken young wolves that rejection wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning, that sometimes the moon goddess had to take away what was wrong so she could give them what was right, that their differences weren't flaws to be hidden, but gifts to be celebrated, and that somewhere out there, their true mate was waiting, someone who would see their worth and value their uniqueness and love them not, despite their strangeness, but because of it, because those differences were marks of destiny rather than curse. And those young wolves would leave the Silver Moon Palace standing taller, believing a little more firmly in their own worth, carrying with them the story of the silver-haired Luna who gave her last water to a dying stranger and found her destiny in the desert sand, who proved that the greatest strength wasn't in dominance or power, but in compassion and sacrifice, who transformed curse into blessing and rejection into redemption, simply by choosing to be kind when the world gave her every reason to be cruel. And they would remember that sometimes salvation comes not from being saved, but from choosing to save others, not from receiving love, but from giving it freely, not from having everything, but from sacrificing what little you have for someone who needs it more, because that is when the moon goddess sees your heart and rewards it with blessings beyond imagination, with love beyond measure, with a destiny written in silver and sealed with the courage to believe that you are worthy of every beautiful, impossible thing the universe wants to give you. If you enjoyed Seraphina and Lysander's story of sacrifice, redemption, and fated love, please leave a comment below telling me what resonated with you most. Was it the moment she chose to give her last water, the slow burn trust building between them, or the powerful message about transforming curse into blessing? I love hearing your thoughts, and your comments truly inspire me to create more stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss future werewolf romance tales featuring alpha kings, rejected mates, powerful omegas, and the kind of destiny-driven love that proves the moon goddess always has a plan even when we can't see it. Hit that notification bell and join our pack of readers who believe in second chances, fated mates, and the transformative power of choosing compassion over cruelty. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next story where another Omega discovers that what the world calls weakness might actually be the greatest strength of all.